I think it's really important, and I feel strongly that Pacific people should take an interest in the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi is a philosophical reference point for understanding the wā, the social and sacred spaces of relationships between Maori and Pacific peoples in Aotearoa, and here's why. First of all, scientific evidence from archaeology and linguistics show that Polynesians became Polynesians in the Western Polynesian culture area, and that settlement of the Pacific Ocean, 1/3 of the whole world surface, was by Western Polynesians from Tonga, Samoa and Fiji. The sequence of settlement was from Western Polynesia some 3,000 BP years ago to Eastern Polynesia as far east as Rapa Nui, and then up north to Hawaii, and finally in 800 BP, Aotearoa was settled from Western Polynesian descendants, the Maori. Secondly, Indigenous knowledges support this connection through origin myths. For Eastern Polynesians, especially Maori, their voyaging traditions trace their origins to a mythical Hawaiki, which scientific evidence proposes is somewhere in Western Polynesia culture area. And thirdly, this ancient and historical connection is evidenced by the teina tuakana banter of the kaumātua on marae all over Aotearoa, especially when some of the manuhiri are from Moananui-a-Kiwa. So sometimes we Pacific visitors are recognised as tuakana, or older siblings, which acknowledges this ancient connection, or we are recognised as teina, or younger siblings, which acknowledges that they are tangata whenua of Aotearoa and that we are visitors. So this wā, this tuakana teina recognition, is acknowledgement of the social and sacred recognition of our connection. A really powerful example for me in recent history about this wā between Polynesian and Maori was in 1929. In 1900, Samoa had been colonised by the Germans. Then after World War I, Samoa came under New Zealand administration, during which the flu epidemic decimated 1/3 of Samoa's population at the time. Samoan activism by the Māori challenged the brutal takeover of Samoa by the New Zealand administration, and some of the Māori leaders were captured and exiled to other countries. One of the Māori leaders was Tamasese Lealofi A'ana III, who was exiled and imprisoned in Mount Eden Jail in 1929. Not many people know this, but Tamasese was visited by Sir Maui Pomare, a New Zealand medical doctor. When he visited Tamasese in his prison cell at Mount Eden Prison in Auckland in 1929, he was moved to tears. And the next day he wrote this letter to the New Zealand Samoa Guardian newspaper. Today I saw Tamasese in jail. I greeted him in his own tongue. We sat and we talked of many things. I said, Tamasese, I am sorry to see you here, and yet I am glad I came to see your face. And so I looked into the countenance of a tamā, an ariki, a prince indeed, the lineal descent of kings whose genealogical lines reach back into the twilight of fable. And yet withal I looked and saw the face of a martyr, a patriot. He has given his all in the cause of his people, the emancipation of his race. I thought and asked myself this question: what have we, New Zealand, done? In our blind, blundering party wrangling and political humbug, we put this man in jail. That is what we have done. This wā between Maori and Polynesian has been debated by many at community debates and discussions. Few people would dispute that the Treaty of Waitangi is New Zealand's founding document. In the treaty journey and debate, we have come a long way, though, since 1840. I agree with Sir Paul Reeves, who was the former Governor-General of New Zealand, in asking to shift the focus away from the need for a technical understanding of the treaty. And this is important. What I think the public have, Pacific people have today, is just the technical understanding of the treaty. What do I mean by that? Number one, that it is an ancient written and signed document with 3 articles. 2, that today its interpretation is highly contentious. 3, how the courts have to interpret what the Parliament has done. And number 4, how the issue is therefore between the Māori and the Crown. For Pacific peoples and other minority groups, this focus leaves out their involvement in the treaty debate, and it fuels confusion, sometimes anger, distancing, misunderstanding, and uninformed judgments about real historical processes of Māori colonisation and failed annihilation by the colonisers. So I feel that now is the time to reflect on another unexamined focus signalled by Bishop Reeves in his Treaty of Waitangi address in 2004. Quote, "But there's another understanding of the treaty which comes out of oral tradition, which cannot be written down on paper. The treaty is something intangible, something pervasive, a powerful area of relationships. The treaty, according to this understanding, is about process. It's about how we honour each other. It's how we pursue common goals. It's about the understanding that what's good for my neighbour must also ultimately be good for me." End of quote. And this is exactly what is mirrored in the historical encounter of the two great Polynesian leaders in 1929, Tamasese and Maui Pomere at Mount Eden Jail. An encounter where Indigenous historical narratives, status, respect, and shared colonial experiences and the fight for sovereignty in their own lands merged in the unspoken sentiments of respect and aroha, in the words "Ia losi tamasese." So I feel that now is the time for Pacific people in Aotearoa to reflect on the Treaty of Waitangi as a turning point, a reference point in our consciousness about the wā between Māori, tangata whenua, and Pacific peoples of Moana Nui Akiwa. What is needed is a philosophical basis for reconceptualising the spaces, the wā, where Māori and Pacific people meet, where they work, how they play, who they marry. We have been thrown together in order to reach this new level of understanding and a way forward in Māori-Pacific relationships in Aotearoa. There are so many historical examples in Pacific Māori relationships where we have stood side by side in solidarity with each other. For one, schooling. In the 1960s and 70s, when I went to school, there were no Māori and Polynesian spaces. Pacific spaces, they were Polynesian. And the Polynesian identity was strong. So Māori and Pacific, we went to school together, played together, and we married each other. If you do some research, you'll see that there was a lot of intermarriage in the 60s and 70s between Māori and Samoans and Tongans. But perhaps the most important example I want to give is that the Māori and Polynesian activism. The Polynesian Panthers and Ngā Tamatoa stood side by side in their fight against racism and the fight for sovereignty for tangata whenua in the 1970s and 80s. So strong, in fact, that it was in the 1970s that instead of Polynesian clubs and schools, it became Māori club and Pacific clubs. And that's that divide and rule thing that has happened over time. This activism is still going on today. In 1972, the Polynesian Panthers helped to establish Te Reo Māori as an official language of New Zealand. Did you know that? And also in 1974, 76, the Dawn Raids. We stood side by side in that as well. And look what we've achieved, all the gains we've made in the last 50 years for Pacific. In 1975, the Māori Land March. 1977, 78, Bastion Point. In 2020, Ihu Mātau. So, we have these these relationships where we are as one